Hey guys, welcome back to the Fungus TCG channel. This is going to be our third video in the Versus series pitting Blue Green Stacks against Blue Red items. And the goal for these in this series is to give tips and guidance on how to approach the items deck from the perspective of Blue Green. So we're going to start by looking at the deck list. First, we have the Blue Red items deck. As you see on screen, this is a list that recently did well at CCS's 11K weekend with over 350 players, piloted by Colin, who is going to be playing the deck today. Notables in this deck, if you have never seen it before, is they are looking to play items with Maurice's Workshop to create a critical amount of items before playing Tamatoa and Dime in the same turn to win outright. They also are going to control the board with stuff like your Maui's and Sisu's Brawls, Be Prepareds throughout the game with stuff like Sapphire Coil. Colin is going to be piloting the deck, as we mentioned today, and he has a lot of experience on this deck and should be able to give us a good representation of what it might look like for a experienced player on the blue-red deck. This list and all the lists are going to be linked down below in the description. I will be piloting the Blue-Green Stax today. This is the list that recently top 8 the CCS 2K. We made a few minor changes from that list to improve the aggro matchup, such as going up on Hefflumps and Woozles and adding Cloud Kicker to this deck. This is focused around ramping to a Clarabelle and gaining card advantage through bounce spells before hitting our opponent with a Bend to My Will and grinding them out. The Dreamborn link for this deck will be provided below, as with all of our decks. Let's take a look at our opening hand on the blue-green deck. Here we see a lot of different pieces that are not necessarily what we're looking for immediately. Notables here are going to be the Popsicle and the Bell and the Grand Montala. These are cards we potentially do want to see in our opening hand but against certain matchups. That being said, we can't keep this hand as is because we do not have the turn 2 ramp. It is the most critical thing in this blue-green deck to hit your turn 2 ramp, whether that be the Sail or your Tipo, and to potentially hit 2 pieces of ramp even. So some options here are to send everything back or potentially send back just everything except for the Popsicle. In this case, I chose to send everything back, including the Popsicle, just to potentially give us one more look at hitting that turn 2 ramp. There is a case to be made for keeping the Popsicle and using that additional draw just to dig a card deeper, plus develop that other resource. The math is pretty close on both of those lines, so I don't think there is a hard difference between. And here is our altered hand. You see we found a few different pieces we were looking for. We did find a Popsicle, which isn't critical in this matchup, but isn't bad to have around, especially if we do need to welcome our own Popsicle or potentially run a Bell out as part of just reducing our hand in the mid game. What we are looking to do with this curve is to throw the Mother Knows Best back with the Tipo, playing the Grand Motala, and starting off with that Popsicle. Basil, Visions, and You're Welcome are all fair game for ink. We do need to find a few different things to make this hand really work in this matchup. We really would like to see a second piece of ramp, and of course we have to find our Clarabelle in order to really start putting pressure on their hand and giving them a reason to react to us. We do have a few different redraws here, so we'll see if we get through over the course of the match. All right, we are on the play for this one on blue-green, starting us off with a Basil into ink and then getting that first redraw for the Popsicle. Again, hoping to find that big Clarabelle really mainly to make that hand complete and to get us into that mid and late game. See a Tamatoa going into ink here, and we'll see if he has the Popsicle or develop to find his workshop. Looks like he did not start with either of those, which is kind of a neutral line for us. We don't really care if he does have one or the other here. The Popsicle potentially does elevate or accelerate him to getting to the Scrooge a little bit sooner to get a free Scrooge while developing his other pieces. It looks like we were able to find a sale actually off of that first couple of draws. So we were able to play that, which is the optimal play in this matchup if we can. It gives us another look to finding some of our game pieces that we really need to be able to participate in this matchup in a meaningful way. So it looks like he also found the sale and is following up with develop to potentially sculpt his hand into finding the workshop and a lot of the other pieces that are going to be really important here. So pretty good start for both players so far, but of course we know our hand was not completely ideal, so we're looking to potentially hit those different pieces along the way. But we get a lot of different looks. Putting a You're Welcome into ink probably means that we have potentially two of these in hand, or maybe just not a better ink option. Keeping the vision in hand also is a nod to finding the Clarabelle that we're going to need for the later game. That Grammatala gives us a couple more looks at finding all the pieces we need to sculpt our hand. And I mentioned in other videos, but just to kind of consider here, we've already seen 3 to 4 extra cards at this point. So even though our opening hand was not necessarily the best, we do have a very good chance of finding the pieces we need. So here we see the queen, which for us is actually relatively difficult to deal with. It means that Grandma Tala is going to have to, at some point, potentially trade with this queen. We cannot have him activating that over and over and finding his game pieces, such as workshops in multiples. Seeing 4 cards at a turn and then just putting that directly into play is going to be really difficult for us. So it looks like we did find the Donald Duck off of this, and we'll see what we have to deal with it. It looks like Grandma Tala singing Mother Knows Best. Just getting our hand down, of course, without Clarabelle, this is a net negative play. We are actually going down a card to just buy a little bit of tempo. So we're really hoping to find our Clarabelle in our next few draws so that we can actually leverage this. Potentially also, instead of Clarabelle, if we are able to find Bend to Our Will, we will actually play that out as well here early just to get that high impact play out. And it looks like Colin did find his workshop off those lines and is establishing his card draw, which is not amazing for us if we are not in position to You're Welcome It with a Clarabelle out. If we do Bend to Our Will here, we can put them on 0 cards and very low ink, which makes that workshop a little bit less efficient, of course, but we are most interested in really just getting rid of that workshop and playing out our normal game plan. Now, remember, we did ink that You're Welcome, which kind of was a nod that we had multiples here because it is a really important card in the matchup. We are going to go ahead and shuffle that workshop into the deck. Of course, finding this Clarabelle here is going to be really critical to us being able to advance our game plan, which is why really in our opening hand, we will often keep a Clarabelle even as that 7 cost character if we know we are playing against some of these slower builds like blue red, blue purple, or purple red, any of the decks that kind of take a more mid-range or controlling stance in the game, a 7-drop Clarabelle is going to be really critical to our winning those games. So it looks like we're able to find the lines we needed to here, but we'll see how it plays out over the course of the game. This is always a game of give and take against these blue-red decks. You really do have to play all of your lines extremely well in order to give yourself the best chance at things, because they do have a lot of catch-up mechanisms, such as that workshop, such as Be Prepared, and if they're able to establish a Sisu with a coil with enough resources to really do something about it, it puts us in a really bad predicament sometimes. Here we see the Quill, which is going to allow him to negate our ability to draw lots of cards off of him this next turn. So here he's able to ink lots of cards and get to really his critical turn. And he knows because of the Clarabelle in play, he needs to just establish items here as much as possible. So he will just run out of Vitalosphere, even though it is not necessarily a high value item at this point. Was able to find that workshop again after we dealt with the first one. So it is something we're going to have to deal with over the next couple of turns. And of course, he can keep his hand relatively low here with the quill and just playing all those resources into ink. The Scrooge here does present a little bit of a conundrum. It makes it so that we have to be aware of his characters at all times because he can trade favorably into the Grandma Tala and the Scrooge. Of course, Clarabelle can take it out as well, but with that Vitalosphere, that can combine to actually kill that Clarabelle off. So we'll see what we're able to make of this hand. Of course, we did draw quite a few cards last turn, so we need to see what our play lines look like. I don't expect we'll be able to get our hand low enough to get a big draw turn out of this unless we saw several pieces of ramp or potentially some bells. He was able to get his hand down to maybe 3 or 4 here, and we drew quite a few cards last turn. So we find ourselves inking some of the cards that we don't find relevant in this matchup as much, like the Muses, and then we are going to Visions looking for this Bend to My Will as quickly as we possibly can. Of course, we know he has the Workshop coming down next turn and potentially getting some card advantage out of that Workshop. So, not gonna be able to bend this turn, but there are so many different redraw effects in this deck that we just wanna cycle through them. If we don't find the if we don't find the bend off of the vision, if we see maybe another vision or another develop or another card draw piece, we want to be taking those so that we can potentially have more looks at a bend. Of course, here we do want to sequence that vision first. If we get something like a how far I'll go off of the vision as part of our card draw pieces, we do need to play those off of our character. So the sequencing on your questing and kind of how when you're inking is going to be really important in these games, making sure that you do things in the right order to give yourself the best chance of winning. So here it looks like we didn't have a lot of card draw pieces that we're able to get back up. So we established a really wide board here. Now, we can make a decision here to go ahead and quest out, and at least with these characters such as Grandma Tala and Donald Duck. But as we talked about before, he has some good characters to be able to contest, and of course, he can take out that Clarabelle with Donald here if he needs to. Kind of our worst case scenario here is him playing out a Be Prepared. It looks like he was able to do that here. So we are going to be looking at going from relatively low resources into a hand where we need to be dealing with him multiple times. So looks like we didn't find that bend just yet. So we're getting one more look at it. We should have enough ink if we inked last turn to be able to look at another 5 cards. So we're 10 cards deep, plus the cards we drew off of that Clarabelle since that turn. And if we're able to find the bend here, that will help us quite a bit. And it looks like we were able to find the first bend. That being said, we did run out a lot of threats last turn. We kind of made that decision to just go wide on that board to potentially set up for the next turn, and we place ourselves in a situation where we did play bend, but it's not necessarily a tempo positive play, right? So him finding this other workshop here is going to actually sort of put us on the back foot. Of course, they do have a lot of redraws in their deck, so he's on a fairly good amount of ink with redraws, and we are in the back seat with not a high lower total, looking for this next threat to be able to pressure our lower total. So, of course, just playing our develop first, or any visions, anything like that, before we establish our next cards. We do want to see as many cards as possible before we make our decisions. And here, just working through what is going to be the best threat in this situation. It looks like establishing a Clarabelle, just get that big body out there. It's going to be the route we're going to go for this one. And then Tipo just to get her hand down and get another threat out there, probably looking to establish some bounce spells or potentially You're Welcome in the near future. Now, we're not going to count on having that bend or will. We know that we're a certain amount of cards deep, and you can kind of card count as you go along here if you're able to do that. Just you think about how many cards we've actually placed at the bottom. If we think about how many cards we played so far that have initially go to the bottom, we played a Grandma Tala, we played 2 copies of Visions, at least 1 copy of Develop Your Brain. So, we're talking about 10, 12, 14 cards at least that are been placed on the bottom of the deck. So we know can only be so far away from our second bend based off of that information in a 60 card deck. So it's not something necessarily all players are able to do as they're going along, but if you play lots of reps on these long games with these blue decks, stuff like Scrooge, stuff like Develop, stuff like Vision, it is a skill you need to start developing in order to really master these decks. Is to think about how many cards have you passed by, what cards have you placed on the bottom, and what are the orderings that you have placed them. In here, it looks like he's recovering very well on the blue-red item side. With that workshop, he's just run into different items here, has the sapphire coil. Another workshop here is going to be really bad for us, given we don't have much lore on the board. We're in a situation where it is going to be fairly difficult for us to actually do anything with his items unless we happen to see a "You're welcome" here, and then are able to find our second bend pretty quickly. So it's not completely out of a shut case at this point. We still have a lot of tools to be able to fight back, but we do know that that second bend is going to be part of our game plan here to be actually establish a winning line. So here with this Tremaine, there are a few different options we can take. He has fairly low card count, so a "You're welcome" can potentially get us a couple of cards on the crackback to potentially find a bend over the next couple of turns. That being said, we're at a point where we don't really want to give him extra cards. We're kind of a rock at a hard place here. A line that we could have considered with this Tremaine is just to rebuy our Bender or Will and put that back into our hand and let him play out his next turn, see what he's able to establish, and then just empty his hand again. That being said, we're not going to be looking terribly great regardless in this situation. He does have the Sapphire Coil established, which means that he's able to, with a couple of extra cards, play a Sisu favorably and potentially take out a Clarabelle. The characters we happen to have assembled at this point in the game also are fairly weak. The only one he has to deal with is this Clarabelle. The T-Pose, of course, are one power, and that's same with that Lady Tremaine. So he doesn't have to actually ink that many cards to deal with our board position. That Be Prepared earlier hitting so many of our 3-power characters really put us into a place where we're going to be resource negative. That being said, we're able to draw 3 cards, which means that we do have some more tools to crack back if he's able to establish a Sisu here, which he almost certainly is going to be able to since he's seen so many cards. But something to consider here is that the Sisus are not good early game cards against our deck, and if they are playing stuff like Fishbone Quill, they are probably putting them into ink. So the total number of Sisus they are actually going to be seeing against us is going to be relatively low. Here, just looking for his decision. If we do get board wiped at this point, our plan is to just, again, rebuild, try to establish more resources that are going to be hard for him to deal with, such as our Clarabelle, such as our Basils, and stuff like Grandma Tala and Scrooge will do in a heartbeat, just to put more pressure on this board. So Tamatoa is not the worst thing we could have seen here. He looks like he is rebuying the workshop with this Tamatoa, which means that we are going to be having to deal with another workshop. But that 8-cost body is fairly tempo negative in terms of what he is establishing against us this turn. So he does give us a small window to be able to actually deal with some of this stuff, where we could potentially can put that Tamatoa back in his hand if we actually have the correct resources. And if we're able to find that second bend, doing both of those things is going to put us into a decent spot. So the Queen offering additional pressure. Again, as I mentioned in some of the other videos, but I'll reiterate here, really the situation we don't want to be in is where he has multiple workshops out. If he has one workshop, he's not gaining card advantage off of those workshops as much as just cycling through his deck. But here we are just looking to potentially deal with this Tamatoa and bend him this turn if we possibly can. So we'll get as many redraws as we can here before we do that. The Queen here is a threat, though. It's something, unless we have multiple bounce spells in this turn, we are going to have to deal with over the course of this game. And really can't deal with it until it's exerted at this point, unless we have to find like a Mother Nurse Best or another one of our You're Welcomes. We do know that at this point we only have 2 You're Welcomes back left in the deck. We have played it once as ink, and we have played one from hand, and rebought one with the Tremaine, of course. But here, we're just looking for those different resources. Looks like we still have enough ink to actually play the Bend or Will if we do find it. An argument can be made here for Heffalumps and Woozles on the Tamatoa and shuffle the Queen in instead. And maybe that is a line that would have net gained us a little bit more in this situation, since not being able to quest with the Tamatoa means he's not be able to get back workshops and some of those more critical resources. And we may have been able to bounce at a later time. So we'll see if that's kind of a critical mistake or how that plays out. But we do know we had a Hellflumps and Woozle start this turn, but that decision to hit the Scrooge was probably made with less cards in mind. So maybe just not playing to all of our outs here and being able to high roll that. You're welcome. And it looks like we're able to find that second bend to put him back to 0 here. So problem we are going to face at this point is that we are actually relatively low on resources as well. All of our board is fairly weak to a big Sisu if he's able to get that card count back up. He does have an active queen here, which was you'll look at several more cards to potentially find another workshop to get his engine going again. So we're a little bit on the back foot here, not having our lower total very high and not really establishing enough of a lock to put him under sufficient pressure. And really, that's why the early turns of these games are going to be your most important. Of course, these blue-red decks have the ability to draw out of those situations, but you just want to play with as much as possible, play it for or the ability to lock them out of as many play lines as possible. Here, it looks like he was able to find that workshop off of the queen, unfortunately, and then establishing another Tamatoa to potentially get either a popsicle just to go up on cards this turn, or just to establish that other workshop, which would be either one of which is going to be fairly brutal, especially if he's able to draw another or a quest with this Tamatoa. That'll more or less be lights out. So he does go for the popsicle in this case just to see a few more cards. And then it looks like he should have the resources here to Vitalosphere that Scrooge and actually deal with it. So playing that Scrooge for free here, just getting his item engine really working again is not what we want to see from the blue-green side. Not completely out of this game, but we would have to have a lot of things go right for us to be able to do anything critical here. So yeah, giving Vitalosphere to that Scrooge for a 6 power and able to take out our Clarabelle here, which is also going to leave us in a very low resource situation. He gets free trades on these T-Pos with one of the ice blocks as well. And he had a few ink as well that with the Sapphire Coil, he could have actually used that instead. All right, just looking for redraws to set up some sort of engine where we can potentially come back in this game. We do have the line of bouncing our bouncing our Tremaine back to our hand to potentially rebuy one of these Bendor wills, but I don't think we're at enough ink really to start doing that consistently before he draws too many cards and puts us into a really bad spot. The Tamatoa is not lethal here, but it might as well be. If he does get to draw extra cards off of this Tamatoa and gain a huge chunk of lore here, we probably are locked out of this game. So our winning lines against these blue-red item stacks are always going to be just keeping them low on resources and making sure that when they do try to go for these big Tamatoa turns, that they've already run through so much of their deck that they're kind of under pressure to actually get to 17 ink, under pressure to actually play it maybe a dime out without the Tamatoa to give us an opportunity to you're welcome it. Hellflumps and Woozles gives us a little bit of action here to potentially get back in the game. We can at least stop the Tamatoa for one turn. But the other problem we run into is we don't have an answer for this queen. This queen is actually going to get another activation out of us, which is going to be brutal. Since they have seen so much of their deck at this point, we've actually shuffled in a bunch of good resources into their deck. That queen flipping the top 4 is actually potentially going to be really rough for us. So here, just getting our hand down so that we can look for more resources in our deck. Finding another Clarabelle is decent here, but we still have a long way to come back here. Almost want to see a Muses here in the next couple of turns just to potentially get that Tremaine back to our hand and rebuy that Bendor Will as soon as possible. From the blue-red side, there's so many nasty things they can do to us at this point. They have a lot of different resources established between the Sapphire Coil, the Queen, and just having a buttload of ink here. So they're able to do quite a bit of damage on a lot of different fronts. And this is the situation that will happen sometimes. This is not a 100% matchup for sure. We play we play to our outs, we play to our strengths, and trying to minimize some of these resources, keep them relatively low on ink, low on hand size, and from not seeing multiple of these workshops. But having found multiple of these workshops is going to put us. It looks like he's establishing a second workshop even before the queen, puts us in a really dangerous situation where he has so many different cards that just shut us out of the game at this point. If we did have a more healthy hand and maybe a board position was a little bit wider with these 3 power characters, we could maybe threaten a little bit more, making him have to actually establish a be prepared, which he was able to hit fairly early. But here we see a third workshop actually kind of putting the nail in the coffin for us. Now, something to keep in mind is if we did have a little more pressure in these games, if they are able to find their workshops and we're kind of trading back and forth, it does give us kind of a target priority change. In some of these situations where the pressure is on and we actually, and they founding workshops and they're kind of drawing with workshops, but we still have a decent sized board or we're able to kind of keep our board state in a way that he has to deal with it. We start looking at some of the other items, right? Like Sapphire Coil here. Without the Sapphire Coil, this Sisu wouldn't have done nearly as much work and wouldn't have taken care of that Clarabelle. So again, if we had a board that looked like Clarabelle, Grandma Tala, Scrooge, stuff like that with these 3 power characters, even if he has a ton of cards, if he's not able to establish a Sapphire Coil with extra cards to play out, that's something to keep in mind. Is if we can potentially get rid of the Sapphire Coil, even if they have lots of cards, it is sometimes okay to just to pivot and get those things. But not our best play lines here. Finding that Basil here just to get the Tamato off the board, just so that we don't get OTK'd here if he does have the dime. But there's so many different play lines that are just not going to be in our favor. He's readying all this ink with a Sisu would play the queen and just putting us in a really bad spot this turn where he's really going to have a insurmountable hand size and enough resources to lock us out of the game. Queen again for the 3rd time being activated, which is really crazy for us. We can't let that happen. Usually, we get a little bit lucky that it missed, but if you get a kind of peek of his hand here, he has so many resources in his hand, it didn't necessarily even matter. The Shield of Virtue here representing potentially untapping that queen if he really had to as well. From his side, he's just looking for the lucky dime to go with this Tamatoa to finish us out. We are out of our Bendor Wills. We played 2 of them, and we played our Tremaine, which got wiped by this Sisu. So really we're kind of in garbage time as far as this deck is concerned. And you'll see here in a few turns, I just scoop it up, even just based off of the look of the game, right? It doesn't look like we're going to be able to do much damage to him and actually finish out the lore totals. Yeah, it's reestablishing that Tamatoa. Even if we return it to his hand, he's pretty okay with that at this point. He has so much ink that we're not really pressuring his tempo part of the game. And just finding more cards to find his lucky dime here from the blue-red side. Nothing else really matters. There is a world, and I've had it happen with these blue-green decks against the blue-red decks, where we are able to take all of their Tamatoas out of their hands, but either between Bendor Will and Basil lines, or just force them to ink. These decks play from 3 to 4 of these big Tamatoas and play 1 lucky dime. So there is a situation where you do want to be tracking those cards, just thinking back to how we were talking about card counting a little bit, and just thinking about what's left in the deck, what are the position of the cards. If We know that we've seen a certain amount of Tamatoas. There are potentially lines where we want to go for just high rolling with a Basil sometimes to get a discarded Tamatoa if we have nothing better to do. Because if we are able to discard all of their big Tamatoas, their winning lines are really narrow. That means they at that point have to use Sisu with Dime or just naturally quest with some of these smaller power characters to actually win the game. And here, just playing some game actions to potentially fight back, just getting the Sisu off of questing, put the Tamatoa back in his hand, but he's perfectly happy to have the Tamatoa in his hand. At this phase of the game, he's probably at 15 or so ink and has a winning line very soon. We're going a little bit wide here and just trying to get some more resources established. This Basil could try to snipe that Tamatoa out of his hand, which I think was my intention here as far as this line is concerned. We do have to deal with this queen that got activated 3 or 4 times, so finally out of here, that potentially gives him more looks at a lucky dime. And then just going with the Basil, see if we can snipe this Tamatoa out of his hand. It looks like he has 5 or 6 cards in his hand, though, so we're definitely in a bad spot here trying to actually make this happen. Hit a Be Prepared, but not something we necessarily care about even in this phase of the game. He's ahead on board as far as we're concerned. This Sisu is established. He has this Tamatoa in hand and a wealth of ink and cards. He is, I believe, at a critical lore total, so that if he does have the dime, it is just a one turn kill for us. And from the blue green side, we really have run through most of our resources that we could have represented to have some kind of comeback mechanism. I believe we've gone through almost all of our Clarabelles at this point. We've gone through all of our Bens, and we have maybe one more You're Welcome in our deck. I'd have to go back and track. Something I probably could have tracked a little bit better. But Tamatoa going to get another just cheap item to keep his engine going, looking for this dime. We have no good real interaction to deal with this dime. His deck is not small enough that we could potentially deck him. There are some decks where you want to keep that line in mind. Blurple is one of them that I've had it come up where they are at such a low uh, deck total that potentially recurring your welcomes and making them draw net 1 card out of their deck actually can put them in a situation where it's going to be critical. But we'll see here that this deck has plenty more cards, and he's seen enough cards with Scourges and put cards on the bottom of his deck that we know that his dime is probably not going to be towards the not going to be the very last card. So I am not sure that we have any more favorable lines into this deck. It looks like he wiped our board and may not even need the dime to win this game with this Tamatoa and Sisu going. Chooses not to. Oh no, I think we have lost the Woozle that Sisu last turn. We'll hit the Woozles on the Sisu to potentially give us another look to bounce this Tamatoa. Really, bouncing the Sisu or the Tamatoa at this point is lights out. We hit the Sisu to potentially try to get a board position here, but I don't think it really matters at this phase of the game which of these we're hitting. Even if we're able to bounce the other one, we're in really bad shape. And yeah, it looks like we didn't find anything of relevance. And I'm not sure we could have found anything at this point. We kind of exhausted all of our resources and got just slamming multiple workshops, getting multiple activations out of that queen really shut us down here. So sometimes this is the way this goes. I don't want to represent that this deck, beats blue red 100% of the time, but you do have winning lines and you do have the ability to actually play them into a corner a lot of times if you're able to find the cards you need and kind of string them together and play well over the course of the game, tracking their card counts, tracking your card counts, and making sure you understand what are the odds of, hey, how many times are they going to be playing a Be Prepared? How good is a Sisu here? If they're holding cards in hand, kind of just managing, what cards to potentially have in their hand, right? I appreciate you guys checking us out for this last video in this series against Blue Red. Wanted to show, what a loss might look like. Here we just saw multiple workshops being chained together, and ultimately he out-resourced us where we had some critical misses. If you enjoy this kind of content, and if you want to see more content from me, whether it be just educational stuff or more play videos, or just fun stuff about the next set and speculation. I'm going to have a lot more coming down the pipeline. I'd really appreciate you dropping a comment and just let me know, hey, how you liked the video, what was interesting to you or what was relevant for you, and what other content you would like to see. Like and subscribe to the channel again for more content. I'm going to be having videos come out fairly consistently, especially after I come back from the Texas PPG event this next week over July 4th weekend. So hoping to come back with some good information from that. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.